Ethan Carter was not a man easily caught off guard. As a high-ranking negotiator for the United Earth Federation, his life had been spent navigating the treacherous waters of intergalactic diplomacy. He had negotiated with hostile alien races, brokered peace deals in war-torn star systems, and diffused numerous diplomatic incidents. His calm demeanor, sharp intellect, and formidable combat skills had earned him the respect and fear of countless species across the galaxy. He wasn't afraid of a challenge, and he wasn't afraid of war, either. But when his ship, the Courageous, touched down on the remote planet of Zyril, Ethan could not shake the unsettling feeling that something was off. The Zyril, the inhabitants of the planet, were a race of women, tall, powerful, and undeniably intelligent. They had no men, a fact that had been a source of curiosity and fascination for the human delegation. The Zyril had maintained their isolationist policies for centuries, rarely interacting with other species, but with the rise of humanity's spacefaring ambitions, Earth had sent a delegation to negotiate trade and cooperation. The Zyril were powerful allies, and their resources were coveted by many, including the United Earth Federation. Ethan and his crew were among the first human diplomats to make contact with the Zyril, and he was determined to ensure the success of this mission. The political ramifications of failure were enormous, and he understood that this delicate negotiation could either bolster Earth's standing in the galaxy or lead to unforeseen consequences. He'd been briefed on the basics of Zyril culture, but there was little known about their internal politics or their social structure. All he knew for sure was that this mission had to succeed. The first thing Ethan noticed when he stepped onto the surface of Zyril was the silence. The air was thick, but not oppressive. It was sterile, almost clinical. The sky above was a deep violet, with massive twin moons hanging low, casting an eerie light over the alien landscape. The city they arrived in seemed to be a blend of natural and technological marvels, with towering spires of gleaming metal and lush greenery coexisting in an almost surreal balance. It was beautiful, yet there was something unnerving about it. As the ship's hatch opened, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by hostile forces, but by something far subtler, more calculating. As Ethan and the crew were escorted through the capital city, it became apparent that the Zyril were not only technologically advanced but deeply secretive. They spoke in riddles, often offering cryptic responses to simple questions. The women of the Zyril were strong, both physically and intellectually. They had mastered genetic engineering, bioengineering, and interstellar travel, and their society was based on a meritocratic system where women were revered for their intelligence, strength, and leadership. There was no visible evidence of men in their society, at least, not in any form Ethan could easily comprehend. The first few days were uneventful: meetings with the Zyril leadership, briefings on trade protocols, and formal dinners that felt almost too stiff. But it was on the fourth day that things began to take an unexpected turn. Ethan had been summoned to a private audience with Prime Matron Zelira, the highest-ranking official in the Zyril government. It was a formal meeting, one that was supposed to seal the deal on several important trade agreements. The Zyril had expressed interest in exchanging technology and biological research with Earth in exchange for human resources, though they hadn't been specific about what resources meant. Ethan assumed they were referring to raw materials or labor. But as he sat across from Prime Matron Zelira in a vast chamber, the true nature of the Zyril's interests became clear. "Mr. Carter," Zelira began, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight, "we have reviewed your species thoroughly. The United Earth Federation has made an impression, and your race has potential. But we find ourselves in a unique situation." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Unique situation, Prime Matron?" "Yes," she said, leaning forward slightly. "You see, our species has existed for centuries without the presence of men. But the time has come for us to acknowledge a simple truth: our numbers are dwindling. Despite our advances in genetics, we cannot reproduce without male seed. Our women are fertile, but we have no men capable of producing offspring." Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Are you saying you need human men for reproduction?" Zelira smiled softly, though her eyes remained intense. "Not just any men. We require your species. Human genetics are unique. There is a rare compatibility between our two species, one that could ensure the survival of both. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't a simple trade agreement, it was something far more complicated, something that could change the course of human history. And what exactly do you expect from us? Zalira's expression hardened slightly. You will remain here on Zyril. Your men will assist us in repopulating our species. You will be welcomed into our society. The room felt suddenly suffocating. Ethan's hand clenched involuntarily, his fingers brushing the hilt of the small sidearm he always carried for protection. He knew this was no ordinary negotiation. His gut told him something was wrong, that this was more than just a request for human assistance. It felt like a trap. Before he could respond, the door to the chamber opened abruptly, and several armed Zyril warriors entered. They surrounded Ethan, their eyes cold and calculating. He immediately stood, ready to defend himself, but Zalira's voice rang out. No need for violence, Mr. Carter, she said, her tone calm but firm. We're not here to harm you. We only wish for cooperation. But your crew, your men, are now our responsibility. We must ensure that the future of our species is secured. What are you talking about? Ethan's voice grew sharper. This isn't cooperation. This is extortion. The warriors moved closer, and Ethan knew his options were running out. He needed to think fast. The Zyril had him trapped, and it was becoming clear that the true nature of their request was far more sinister than he had imagined. They were not asking for an alliance. They were demanding that humanity provide them with what they needed to survive, by any means necessary. Zalira's eyes glinted with something unreadable. We have no choice but to proceed this way, Mr. Carter. We have tried for centuries to find another solution, but now there is no time left. The future of our species depends on you and your men. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. There was no way out. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He was not going to play their game. Not without a fight. Listen, he said, his voice low but steady. I don't know what kind of trap you think you've set, but I won't allow this. You can't force us into this. Zalira's eyes softened, but her resolve did not waver. You will, Mr. Carter. You will. With that, the doors to the chamber closed behind him, and Ethan found himself imprisoned on a planet where the very survival of his species seemed to be hanging by a thread. The silence that followed Ethan's imprisonment on Zyril was deafening. He had been locked in a sterile, white-walled room that seemed to absorb sound, isolating him from the rest of his crew. His mind, however, was anything but silent. He knew one thing with certainty: he couldn't let this go on. He had to think. He had to find a way out. The Zyril were technologically advanced, intelligent, and formidable, but Ethan had something they didn't. He had the mind of a negotiator, and he had the skills of a fighter. He was no ordinary diplomat. He was trained to see through lies, to find the hidden motives, and most importantly, to fight when words alone weren't enough. His first few days in captivity were spent in a state of carefully controlled panic. The Zyril women who guarded him were always calm, their expressions unreadable. They rarely spoke to him, and when they did, it was either to deliver orders or ask questions about human physiology. They were studying him. Ethan knew that the Zyril weren't interested in killing him, at least not yet. He was too valuable. But that didn't mean he wasn't in danger. He was a pawn in their game, a resource to be exploited. The room he was confined to was not a cell in the traditional sense. It was more of a waiting room, a sterile space meant to keep him comfortable until the arrangements were finalized. The walls were lined with digital screens that flickered with data about human genetics, physiology, and culture, mostly the things the Zyril had learned from their research. There were no bars or chains, but the subtle surveillance system in place was oppressive. It made him feel like an animal in a zoo, constantly under observation. He had spent the first night in restless contemplation, replaying his interaction with Zalira over and over in his mind. What was their true plan? Why was the need for human males so urgent? He had known there were many species in the galaxy with reproductive problems, but this seemed far beyond what he had expected. The Zyrael were not just seeking help, they were desperate. And desperation often led to dangerous decisions. He needed to find a way to turn the tables. The second day brought an unexpected twist. He was summoned once again to meet with Zelira, but this time, she was accompanied by another woman, taller, with sharp features and dark, intelligent eyes. Ethan noticed immediately that she carried herself with a quiet but undeniable authority, one that seemed to rival Zelira's own. Her presence was commanding, and though she didn't speak, her gaze never left him. "I see you're still alive, Mr. Carter." Zelira's voice broke through the tense silence, and her lips curled into a faint smile. "I trust your accommodations are adequate?" Ethan didn't flinch at her condescending tone. "I'm fine," he said, his voice as cool as he could make it, though his mind raced. "What do you want now?" Zelira's eyes darkened. "We have been considering your position. Your crew, your men, we could use them. They have value." Ethan clenched his fists. "What do you mean by that? You're not going to manipulate them the same way you've been manipulating me." Zelira leaned in closer, her voice lowering as though sharing a secret. "You misunderstand, Mr. Carter. This isn't about manipulation. This is about survival. Our species has tried everything to repopulate. Cloning, genetic modification, artificial insemination, nothing works. We need diversity. And that's where you and your men come in. You are the key to saving us." Her words hung in the air, cold and unfeeling. Ethan fought the urge to shout, to lash out, but he knew that anger would get him nowhere. He had to think, and he had to do so quickly. His crew was still locked away somewhere on this planet, and he had no idea what they were going through. For all he knew, they might be facing the same fate, forced into breeding experiments, trapped like cattle. "Diversity," Ethan muttered, his mind spinning. "Is that what this is really about? You're so desperate you're willing to sacrifice lives for your own survival?" Zelira's eyes flickered with something, resentment, perhaps, but she maintained her composure. "We are not sacrificing lives, Mr. Carter. We are ensuring the future of our species. Your people have something we need. You should consider it an honor." "An honor?" Ethan nearly laughed at the absurdity of it all. The way she spoke, as if it were a matter of simple cooperation, only solidified the gravity of their plans. But he couldn't afford to be angry now. He had to remain calm, composed. The survival of not just his crew, but the future of humanity, depended on his next moves. "Tell me," he said, his voice steady but laced with sarcasm. "Why should I trust you? Everything you've said points to manipulation, not cooperation. You've imprisoned us, you've lied to us, and you expect us to help you repopulate?" Zelira's expression remained unreadable, but the dark-haired woman beside her stepped forward. She spoke for the first time, her voice low but firm. "Because if you don't, we will all perish. And when that happens, humanity will be nothing but a footnote in the galaxy's history." The words struck Ethan like a blow. He knew that she wasn't lying. The Zyrael were clearly in danger of extinction, and that was not a situation to be taken lightly. However, their desperation could be their undoing. If they thought they could simply take what they needed from humanity, they had made a grave mistake. "I'm not a fool," Ethan said, staring directly into Zelira's eyes. "You've underestimated us. You've underestimated me. You might have technology and power, but you don't have the one thing that will get you what you need, cooperation." Zelira's lip curled slightly, her patience wearing thin. "Then what would you propose, Mr. Carter?" Ethan let a faint smile cross his lips. "A deal. You want human genetics, you want the survival of your species. Fine. But there's more to this than just breeding. You need allies, not slaves. You need to stop treating us like cattle and start treating us as equals. And if you want that, you'll have to negotiate like the diplomat you claim to be. No more manipulation. No more forced servitude." Zelira studied him for a long moment, her calculating gaze piercing. She opened her mouth to respond, but the dark-haired woman, who had remained silent until now, intervened. "Zelira," she said quietly, her voice carrying an air of authority that made both Zelira and Ethan pause. "Let us entertain his proposition." Ethan turned to the woman, studying her carefully. There was something about her presence that made him instinctively trust her, something about the way she spoke and carried herself that suggested she understood more than she let on. Zelira hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Very well. We'll entertain it. But know this, Mr. Carter, we are running out of time. If you waste our opportunity, the consequences will be severe." Ethan's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. This was his chance to find an opening, a way to turn the tables and secure his crew's freedom. He had to act quickly, because with each passing moment, the Zyrale's plans were becoming clearer, and his options were dwindling. "Let's begin," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of determination that Zelira couldn't ignore. The game had changed. Ethan wasn't just negotiating for survival anymore, he was negotiating for freedom. And in this strange, alien world, he was about to prove that the mind and spirit of a human were far more powerful than anything the Zyrale had ever known. The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan sat across from Zelira and the mysterious woman, whom he had learned was called Leora. The negotiations had begun in earnest. But Ethan wasn't just trying to outsmart them, he was trying to buy time, trying to turn the tide in his favor. Every word he spoke was calculated, and he needed to ensure that the Zyrale understood that the humans weren't some resource to be harvested at will. They had to see that if they wanted their survival, they would have to fight for it, fight for a future where both species could coexist. "Here's the deal," Ethan said, his voice steady but sharp. "You want human genetics. Fine. But that's not enough. You want allies, people who will stand with you when the next crisis comes. You won't survive long if you continue to treat other species like livestock." Zelira's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You've isolated yourselves for too long, Zyrale. You've hoarded your knowledge, your technology, your resources. And now you've reached a point where survival is no longer a matter of just what you have in your labs or your genetics chambers. You need to learn how to cooperate with others. The way you've been running things, keeping your species to yourselves, has only led to this desperation. If you want us to help you, you'll have to change your ways. You'll have to become a part of something greater than just the Zyrale." Leora, who had been silent up until now, spoke. "And what would you propose, Mr. Carter? You ask us to trust you, to cooperate. But we have already seen how cooperation works. We gave you our terms, and you didn't meet them." Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "You gave us nothing. You tried to force our hand, believing that we'd just roll over because of your desperation. The truth is, you've always treated other species like inferior beings. That's why you're on the brink of extinction. You've never built a true alliance with anyone, and now, when it's too late, you want to bargain. But we're not just going to give you what you want because you demand it. You'll have to earn it." Zelira's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Leora's expression, however, had softened slightly. Ethan had caught her attention. He could tell. The cracks in the armor of the Zyrale's pride were starting to show, even if they didn't want to admit it. Ethan pressed on. "You want our genes, but more than that, you need our cooperation. So I'm proposing something different. A truce. A real partnership. One where we don't just give you human males to repopulate your species. Instead, we'll build something bigger. We'll create a joint venture. Earth and Zyra working together to ensure that both of our species survive and thrive." Zelira's gaze hardened. "And why would we ever agree to such terms?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Because, without it, you'll never overcome the challenges you're facing. You're on the edge of extinction, Zyrale. Your people are dying, and your methods haven't worked. You can't clone your way out of this. You can't genetically engineer your way out of it. And the longer you isolate yourselves, the weaker you become." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Leora's eyes flickered, a sign of curiosity, and maybe even a hint of doubt. Ethan took a risk, one that he knew could either win them the negotiation or seal their fate. The Federation has faced extinction before. We've been on the brink of destruction more times than I can count. But we learned how to build alliances. We learned to trust, to work together. You're right, we can't give you everything you want, and I can't promise that your extinction will be averted just by human participation. But together, we can make a stronger future. We have technology that you can't even fathom. We can share knowledge that could rebuild your world, cure diseases, and make your species stronger than ever before. He took a breath. But we won't do it if you continue to treat us as nothing more than breeding machines. You need to prove that you can be more than that. We want a future where both species thrive, not a future where we're just a means to an end. So here's the deal, give us a reason to trust you. Show us that you're capable of cooperation. If you can do that, then we'll help you. Otherwise, this ends now. There was a long silence. Zalaira looked at him as if weighing the truth of his words. Ethan could see the internal conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe she could control this situation, that her species could be saved by brute force alone. But deep down, she knew that wasn't enough. They needed help, and they needed cooperation. As proud as the Zyrael were, the desperation for survival was starting to eclipse their arrogance. Finally, Zalaira spoke, her voice tinged with reluctant understanding. You are right, Mr. Carter. We have relied too long on our own strength, on our own methods. But the future of the Zyrael is at stake. If you can truly offer us a way forward, then we will consider your proposal. Ethan didn't allow himself to show any sign of triumph. This was just the beginning. They weren't out of danger yet. They had to survive this negotiation, and there were still many hurdles ahead. But for the first time since landing on Zyrael, he saw a flicker of hope. The Zyrael weren't entirely beyond redemption. If they could be convinced to shift their worldview, to see humans as allies rather than tools to be exploited, then perhaps they could work together for mutual survival. Over the next few days, Ethan was allowed more freedom, though always under close watch. The Zyrael leadership seemed to be seriously considering his proposal, and it was clear that they were grappling with their options. Zalaira, who had once been a fierce and inflexible leader, was now showing signs of doubt. The discussions between Ethan and the Zyrael became more focused on finding common ground. As the negotiations continued, Ethan noticed something important. The Zyrael were beginning to listen. The rigid structure of their society, which had once been unyielding, was showing cracks. During one of the sessions, Ethan suggested they bring in some human specialists, scientists, engineers, and doctors, to begin a joint collaboration on genetic research and resource management. It was a risky move, but Ethan knew that the key to breaking the stalemate was demonstrating tangible benefits. The Zyrael needed to see that the humans were not only willing to help but that they had valuable knowledge and technology that could propel both species forward. Zalaira, though reluctant, agreed. And so, a team of human experts was dispatched to the Zyrael's genetic laboratories, where they worked alongside their alien counterparts to develop solutions that could benefit both species. It wasn't easy. The Zyrael were still deeply mistrustful of the humans, but over time, as the collaborations progressed, something incredible began to happen. The human experts, with their fresh perspectives, began to introduce new methodologies and ideas that the Zyrael had never considered. Slowly, the walls between the two species began to lower. Ethan's negotiation skills, his unyielding belief in diplomacy, and his ability to forge unexpected alliances were starting to pay off. There was still much to be done, but the first cracks in the Zyrael's isolationist policies had appeared. The alliance, though fragile, had begun. But there was a twist. Just as things began to look promising, a faction of radical Zyrael leaders, those who refused to let go of their old ways, began to oppose the growing human influence. They viewed the human-led collaborations as a threat to their power, and they started to sabotage the joint efforts. The very people who had initially welcomed Ethan's presence now saw him as a destabilizing force, one that threatened the balance of their society. This new opposition was about to make things much more complicated. Ethan had to figure out how to navigate this new crisis. If he didn't, The fragile alliance he had worked so hard to build could fall apart. He couldn't let that happen, not when they were so close to securing a future for both species. As the dark clouds of political strife began to gather once more, Ethan realized that the real battle was just beginning, and this time, it would require more than just negotiations. It would take everything he had, his ability to lead, to fight, and to unite disparate forces, to secure a future for both humanity and the Zyrael. The alliance was fragile. Ethan had worked tirelessly, used every trick he knew, and had brokered the most delicate agreements to ensure that the Zyrael and humanity could coexist and survive. Yet, despite the progress they had made, there were those among the Zyrael who saw any sign of human involvement as a betrayal. The tension was palpable. The radical faction, led by a powerful and influential Zyrael named Varker, was not content to let things slide. His followers were numerous, influential, and fiercely protective of their old ways. To them, Ethan's negotiations represented a threat to their cultural purity, a step toward a future they did not want. Varker had been a silent observer up until now, but his displeasure with the growing human influence had finally reached a boiling point. He had quietly been amassing a power base, and now he was ready to strike, to force his vision of the Zyrael future onto everyone. His faction was more militaristic and aggressive than Zelyra's leadership, and they were willing to use force to ensure that the old way of life was preserved. It began with sabotage. The joint human-Zyrael genetic labs that Ethan had helped establish were attacked. Critical research was destroyed, and scientists from both species were injured or killed. The facility that had become a symbol of the potential for cooperation was now a battleground, its halls filled with the sounds of screaming and chaos. Ethan had been in the middle of a tense strategy meeting with Zelyra when he received the news. The panic in the air was immediate. Zelyra's face went white as the reports flooded in, and the monitors began flashing red, indicating breaches in security across the base. "Varker," she said bitterly, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "I should have known." The Zyrael leader clenched her fists. "He has always opposed change. His faction believes in isolation, in domination. He will never accept cooperation. We need to stop him before this gets out of hand," Ethan replied, already thinking ahead. The situation was dire, but he had faced dire situations before. His mind clicked into action. "We need to shut down his operations and restore order, fast. We can't afford to let this escalate into a full-scale rebellion." Zelyra nodded, but her face was darkened by doubt. "Varker's power base is entrenched. He's built a network of loyal followers. His forces will be formidable." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Then we'll have to outsmart him. I've seen worse odds. But we don't have much time. You need to mobilize your forces, get your best fighters in position." Zelyra hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "I'll do what I can. But you must understand, Mr. Carter, Varker will not yield easily. He will strike without mercy." Ethan knew that the upcoming battle wouldn't just be fought with weapons. It would be a fight for the very future of their alliance. If they couldn't defeat Varker now, all of the progress they had made would be undone. The Zyrael would continue to descend into isolation and warfare, and humanity's involvement would end in tragedy. Ethan was fighting for more than just survival. He was fighting for the future of two species. Zelyra gave the order, and within moments, her security forces were mobilized. Ethan, armed with his quick thinking and a plasma sidearm, joined the ranks. But he knew that brute force wouldn't win this war, not entirely. What he needed was strategy. He needed to outwit Varker. The battle begins. The battle for the genetic research facility began almost immediately. As the human and Zyrael forces clashed with Varker's radical faction, the sounds of plasma blasts and energized weapons filled the air. The enemy was well prepared, heavily armed, and ferocious in their attacks. But Ethan had always believed in the power of a well-planned strategy over mere strength. He had seen firsthand how unbridled aggression could lead to chaos, and he wasn't going to let Varker's tactics destroy everything they had worked for. The facility was a maze of corridors, laboratories, and research stations. Ethan, alongside a group of Zyrael soldiers loyal to Zelira, made their way through the building, systematically clearing rooms and securing key areas. He wasn't just trying to fight. He was trying to buy time for Zelira to take control of the central command and shut down Varker's access to the facility's main systems. As they advanced, Ethan's mind worked at lightning speed, calculating their next moves, analyzing the enemy's weaknesses. He could feel the pressure mounting, but he remained calm. Varker's forces were well trained, but they weren't prepared for the unexpected tactics Ethan had in mind. They'd underestimated him, and now they would pay the price. "We need to take control of the reactor core," Ethan said to one of Zelira's soldiers. "If we shut it down, we can disable the facility's defenses and force Varker to the negotiation table." The soldier looked uncertain. "But that would leave us vulnerable." "It's a risk we have to take," Ethan replied. "We need to cripple his ability to fight back. If we can do that, we win." The soldier nodded and signaled the team to proceed. As they reached the reactor core, they encountered fierce resistance from Varker's forces. Plasma fire crackled through the air as explosions rocked the walls, sending debris scattering. But Ethan didn't flinch. He had one mission: to break Varker's hold on the facility. "Cover me," he ordered. As his team provided cover fire, Ethan dashed toward the control panel, his heart racing. His mind was a blur of thoughts, analyzing the enemy's movements, calculating risks, all while executing precise actions to shut down the core's power. A blast hit the wall beside him, throwing him off balance. But he pushed forward, the cool logic of battle guiding him through the chaos. He reached the control panel and, with a few quick inputs, initiated the shutdown sequence. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, a loud rumble reverberated through the building as the lights flickered and the facility's weapons systems powered down. The central defense grid was offline. Varker's forces, now blind and vulnerable, had lost their most significant advantage. Ethan turned to Zelira's soldiers. "Now we push forward." The final confrontation. The final confrontation came just as Ethan had predicted. Varker, realizing that his position was weakening, led a final assault on the central control room. Ethan, knowing that this was their last chance, gathered his team for the final push. The control room was large and intimidating, filled with monitors and complex machinery that powered the entire facility. It was here that the fate of their alliance would be decided. Varker, surrounded by his most loyal followers, stood at the far end of the room, a dark figure silhouetted against the glowing screens. His eyes were filled with rage, but there was also fear, a fear that came from realizing that his faction's stranglehold on the Zyrael was slipping away. "Mr. Carter," Varker sneered as Ethan and Zelira's forces entered. "So, this is the end of your pathetic little alliance?" "It's the beginning of a new future, Varker," Ethan replied, his voice steady but full of conviction. "Your people need more than just strength. They need unity. And if you refuse to understand that, you'll destroy everything." Varker's eyes burned with fury. "You've corrupted them. You've poisoned their minds with your weak human ideals. But you're wrong. The Zyrael will never bow to another species." Ethan raised his plasma sidearm. "Then you'll die fighting alone." The standoff was tense, but Zelira spoke up, her voice cutting through the silence. "Varker, it's over. You've lost." Varker's expression twisted in defiance, but in his heart he knew she was right. His power had been broken. The radical faction that had once threatened to destroy everything was now in disarray. As Zelira's forces closed in, Varker realized the truth of his situation. The old ways were gone. His people had moved beyond the need for isolation and conquest. They had to work with others, or they would perish. In the end, it wasn't Ethan's weapon that defeated Varker. It was the simple truth that humanity had brought with it. Cooperation was the key to survival. And Varker's inability to see that would be his downfall. The final battle was won. The radical faction had been crushed, and the facility was under control. The Zyrael had been given a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to forge a new path forward. Ethan had played a crucial role in ensuring that the future of both humanity and the Zyrael would be one of cooperation and mutual respect. As the dust settled and the last remnants of the battle faded, Ethan stood with Selira, looking out over the city that would soon be the heart of their new alliance. They had faced impossible odds, and yet they had emerged victorious. The fight for survival was far from over, but for the first time, there was hope. And with that hope came a promise that no matter how dark the road ahead, humanity and the Zyrael would walk it together. This final section highlights the climactic conclusion to the conflict, where Ethan's leadership, negotiation skills, and strategic thinking come together to dismantle